Hello, welcome to Open Sourcing Mental Illness. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is an important topic in my mind, and I'm glad that Ed could come out here and join us here in Seattle, all the way from Indiana, to talk to us tonight and share his experiences. I wanted to say again that if you want to tweet about tonight's event, please use the OSMI and Seattle hashtags. That way I can track all of that later. So this event is being hosted by the Seattle PHP user group. So we're really glad that you guys could come. You can find our website on meetup.com/SeaPHP and on Twitter, SeaPHP as well. And tonight we are in the Surf Incubator. This is one of their special venue locations called the Dice Cabana. This is a cool event space that's available for rent. You can go out to their website, surfincubator.com, check out the event space, and if you're interested in hosting an event here as well. They've been a big supporter of our user group, and we've had events here in the past, so I always like to kind of plug them a little bit. And got speaker interference.
Yeah, probably me. Hey, it's done.
Also wanted to mention our sponsors for tonight, who covered the cost of the venue and our snacks. We got Ed's Travel here. There's Engine Yard, who's an awesome platform as a service cloud hosting company. And there's also SiteGround, which is another web hosting company. Specializes in, I don't know if they specialize, but they're considered a very good Joomla and WordPress host if you are interested in those products. And then there's also GitHub, which is every developer's favorite website for hosting code and using Git repositories. So thank you to them. Please tweet thank you to them if you feel like it. Tonight is also a part of the Engine Yard Prompt Initiative. If you visit prompt.engineyard.com, you'll probably see Ed's face on there, as well as a few of the other speakers that are speaking about mental health in the tech industry across the country. So definitely check that out. There's links to resources about mental health, and Ed probably might have a few other things to say about them as well. I'll let him do that. So here we are, Open Sourcing Mental Illness with Ed Finkler, also Funkatron on Twitter. So tell him how awesome the job he did tonight, and I'll just turn the time right over to him.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. I threw away that crappy microphone, and I'm going to use this one. Hey, look, there's Jeremy right there. Let's see here. Where am I looking? Gotta find. Oh, hey, here's my slides back there. Is that no? I want to hit that button. Yeah, I figured it out. Yay! Thanks, everybody. Yeah, my name is Ed Finkler. I work for a company called FictiveCan. If you're really curious, you can find me on Twitter at Funkatron, and my website is funkatron.com. If you're super curious about that. And so you may be wondering to yourself, who is this person? I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a developer kind of person. I've been doing development for a long time, web development, that kind of things. And sometimes I make music and do other kinds of nerdy stuff. Like I really like movies, I really like books, and so kind of traditional sort of lots of stereotypes of developer types. But I also have a mental illness, or I guess a couple, really. Now I'm here, I'm just a person. I don't have a degree in psychology or psychiatry. I took a couple classes in college, which means that I can act like I talk intelligently about it. But I'm really just here to talk about what it's like to have a mental illness from my perspective. That's all I really know. I know what it's like for me. And I may swear a lot, so if that bothers you, I hope you can forgive me for that. Yeah, so that's what. But I'm going to start off with something. It's funny, I've given this talk like 12 times, and I still say like 1,000 times every time I give it. But this is a new thing I'm going to do. I'd like to do an informal survey. So this is a class participation portion of it. I'm curious, how many of you need glasses or contacts? I would like you to raise your hands. Hi, like almost everybody in here needs that. That's interesting. Or you know somebody who does. I would imagine now I've got 100% if you know somebody who does. I'm curious, are you afraid to tell people about it? Is anyone here afraid that they're like, shit, I can't mention that to anybody. They might think I'm an asshole. Right? Okay. Would people ever say to you, like, maybe you're not trying hard enough? Or have you tried squinting? Have you tried that? You tried? Right. I have 5 cavities when I was a kid because I don't know whether I just didn't figure out how to brush my teeth until I was 11. But that was another thing. I mean, there's probably most of you, well, sometimes that might be slightly more embarrassing because you're like, I have cavities all the time. But, and maybe it's because you just do a really crappy job of brushing and flossing your teeth. But, I would say that probably most of you are not embarrassed to talk about like, yeah, I'm going to the dentist. I got a cavity, I got a root canal, because I didn't really take care of it, and I got, didn't take care of it. Well, okay, and then we can think about some other things that are more serious stuff, and not to bum everybody out. I'll bum you out like in 15 minutes, but how many of you know somebody or you've dealt with it, have dealt with a metabolic disorder like diabetes? Known somebody who has dealt with that. So almost everybody here has dealt with that. Yeah, I have my father and my brother both developed type 2 diabetes, so I'm a genetic, awesome, really set for that. And I love candy. And then how many of you have known somebody who's had to deal with cancer? Has dealt with it? Everybody in this room has had to deal with cancer. And has anyone of you ever thought to yourself when you're dealing with this guy who's got, or this woman who has cancer, it's like maybe you should try not developing tumors? Could you work on that maybe a little bit? I mean, maybe we could just try harder and it would work better if because I know that you have to go through chemotherapy right now, but it's kind of affecting your work. And we really need you here. So could you just try harder? Could you? Well, okay, I'm going to ask a question. I'm not going to ask a question about too specific, but I want you to try to answer this one honestly. You don't have to say that you're dealing with this kind of stuff, but how many of you would feel comfortable talking to your boss about mental illness? Okay, so if I'm adding that up, which what's that? That would be maybe 10% of this audience. Now, 100% of you, would any of you, if you had cancer, be afraid of talking to your boss about that? Nobody. Okay, you'd be afraid. Okay, so I'm not, nothing wrong with that, but some people might feel that way. And a lot of things, there's certain things that are, you're not afraid. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it would not be a comfortable conversation, and probably it's not an exciting thing to talk about, you don't want to do that. But, and because the medical issues are private issues, but unfortunately, when you know that they're going to impact people around you, you kind of maybe have to talk about it, right? The same way you might have to talk about diabetes. Or the same way they might be like, well, you know what, I have corrective lenses because my eyes are fucked up, so I need to wear some corrective lenses. And that is not a thing. People seem to be comfortable with wearing glasses. They're not like invisible glasses that appear. Not everybody tries to trick the world and wear contact lenses. Some people are even okay with glasses, and it's not like they're segregated out or thought that they're not putting, aside or thought that they're kind of some kind of jerk or something like that. But the interesting thing is that, when I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about this openly, but the thing is that the vast majority of people would not be comfortable talking with their boss. I'm curious, so let's not boss. Boss can be scary because a boss is like, oh, that's somebody who might be able to really screw my life up if they know that I have some kind of weakness, and I think that's why we're afraid of talking about that. So let's say like a colleague, somebody you work with, how many of you would be cool talking about like a mental health issue with a colleague? Right, so a few more of you. I'm sorry? Depends on the colleague. So we can imagine some of them, you'd be like, I don't like this person, they can suck it. But there's some people who, would be cool with it. Right, right. And it depends on the illness. Yeah, right, right. There's sort of different things that are sort of more acceptable and less acceptable. Because some people think that, well, if you have bipolar disorder, that means that maybe you're going to stab somebody. Right. And and you could probably see, like, if you might be a little more comfortable talking to a friend, right? Somebody who knows you and you feel like you can trust them to mention it, or talking to a family member. And let's just say, like, somebody who really, let's say, you could say friend or family member, because some of us, don't get along with our families, or some of our families. Like, but somebody who you do, like a friend who you trust pretty well, that you can think of, would you be comfortable talking about with that? Like, talking about a mental health issue? Now, maybe half the people raise their hands. Now, it could be because you don't care and don't want to talk about it, but so it's not like 100%. I mean, most of the people are like, yeah, I gotta wear glasses, dude. It's okay. Or it turns out I got diabetes and this sucks, and I'm going to talk to them about it. That is not a big deal, but we are scared to death to talk about mental health issues with people, and what I'm going to try to talk about, I'm going to try to talk openly about what kind of stuff I deal with, but also I want to talk about how that affects us and how it makes it more harmful to us when we deal with that. So I'm going to go on and talk about, like, the diagnoses that I have and the things that I deal with on a daily basis. The big thing that I deal with is something called generalized anxiety disorder. So at least that's the name that they put on the thing that like I deal with, and usually it's, how do you describe that? It's something where you ever get, okay, so a good example was the 2 hours coming over here, because I've never been to this. I've been to Seattle once before, and I came to Seattle today. I was coming over here today, and I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to get there. And thankfully, I had a friend of mine who could help me out with that, who could kind of get me around. But I was at the hotel, and it's like, okay, I have to take a shuttle over here, and I don't exactly know where I'm going, and all that stuff. And so I'm trying to describe. I was nervous at, like, if like a 0 was like I'm totally freaking cool, right? And a 10 is like I'm having a complete panic attack breakdown. I was probably at about like a 6, and that is because I did not exactly know where this was, even though I had the address, and really realistically I could get over there okay. But I was sweating, and I was really antsy, and I could feel my muscles ached, because it was like it felt like my nerves and my muscles were clenching everything. When I get if I get particularly freaked out, I will get. It feels like a knot, like right below my sternum. I'll get this pressure in here. It feels like I've got, like, the rope tied like a knot, like just in there. And that, I would say on a day-to-day basis, I gave it that scale. I was probably at a 6 or something like that. I'm probably at a 3, like, every day. Just a normal, I'm just hanging out. This is my normal day. I go to work, and I know how to do all this stuff and things like that. But I'm at that level of anxiety most of the time. So, and to go along with that, I deal with depression as a part of that. When I was younger, as a teenager, I was diagnosed, I guess I was 13 with depression, and that kind of goes hand in hand with that, which I'll talk about that. But that's something I've struggled with a lot too. I have adult ADD, and I think most people probably know what that means, is that I have troubles kind of staying focused on something. Particularly, I have a lot of trouble doing something that I don't really want to do right at that moment. I take medication that helps with that, but that's sort of the other side of these things, is that, and I think it kind of goes hand in hand with people who have anxiety disorders. A lot of times they have sort of issues focusing. But sometimes there's something I'm really interested in, I really tend to be hyper-focused on it. And I'm really good at that. And then, of course, if something interrupts that, I get really pissed off. Like if somebody's like, hey, could you help me with this? And I'm in the middle of trying to figure out a problem, like when I'm programming or something like that. And that becomes like a big thing for me. It's like, oh, no, stop. It's like you have to tear yourself away and try to change. It's very hard for me to change courses like that. And that's a big thing. But Anyway, medicine I take. So I take, how many pills do I take? I guess I take 6 things a day, and I think most of them, some of them have to do with mental health, and there's a couple other things, like I take a statin for like high cholesterol. I have high cholesterol. I don't think most people are like, yeah, you got high cholesterol, it's just a genetic thing. I mean, I kind of eat shitty, but it's really not just because of that. Like, I tried taking fish oil, and I tried taking other things. It's like, no, it's just saying, I started taking the statin, I take a small dose of that, and suddenly my cholesterol drops like 150 points. I am not, most people would not be too terribly afraid of talking about that. It's like, yeah, so it's something I got to take, right? That's not a big deal. But the things that people are scared about is I take a thing called Lexapro, and that's an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it's part of a long history class of drugs. The Prozac was the first one that came out. Would have been the late 80s, I think. Yeah. And so I take Lexapro. I take Boost Bar, which is a thing that helps with anxiety, and it seems to help. It seems to sort of, a lot of things that I talk about, the vague terms I'm talking about, it seems to sort of do this. That is like almost exactly the medical like definition of what it does. Is we think it does this. So it makes you feel real confident when you take it. So Boost Bar seems to help like enhance the effect of the SSRIs a lot of times. So if people take Boost Bar and an SSRI like Lexapro, it seems like it actually kind of enhances the effectiveness of that. Anyway. So Strattera is a medication that I take for adult ADD. I think it's the only one on the market that they can prescribe for adult ADD that is not an amphetamine. So that's awesome because my insurance just dropped it to tier 3, which means that it costs now twice as much as it did before. So it would cost me $10 to take Speed, but something that is not Speed that helps me now costs me $90 for 30 pills. So that's pretty awesome. Yeah, pretty cool insurance stuff. They'd rather have me take Speed. And then Klonopin, which is a benzo like Xanax or things like that. I take that, and that helps me kind of calm down with stuff. If you ever had to say take Xanax or something like that, or something of that nature for anxiety attacks or things of that nature, Klonopin seems to it comes on slower, and it seems to last longer. And I don't know. When I take Xanax, it's like when it stops, I feel shittier. And I kind of, so I don't know. Klonopin worked better for me, but, I tried Xanax for a while too. So yeah. So that's like the basic intro. That's like the stuff that I deal with. But what is it like? And that's kind of the interesting part. And I talked a little bit about this. So the anxiety that I deal with, I guess, the thing is that like anxiety is kind of a normal reaction in many cases, and it's a typical reaction. It's something that the human body and the brain goes through, but it goes through, and it's supposed to happen in things like I am being attacked by a lion, or or that lion caught me and bit my arm off, or something like that. That is an appropriate time to have an anxiety reaction, to have some sort of fight or flight reaction. If you reverse them, it doesn't matter. It's the same words. The issue with this generalized anxiety disorder that I have, or other anxiety disorders, is typically you have them in cases where it is not appropriate, where it's like, hey, okay, here's a good example. If somebody at my work, typically like a manager or a boss, says, hey, could I just remind you I want to talk to you on Monday about that. About something, so just remind me and I'll talk to you about that. So, okay, so he tells me that like late Friday or something like that. And so by a couple hours into Friday, I believe that I will lose my job and I'm going to be homeless and I will die in like the next week. That is, that's sort of I formulate a scenario where everything goes to shit somehow. And I just assume that everything's going to be terrible, and so I'm constantly like kind of freaked out about it, and like white knuckling it for a whole weekend. And usually what happens is like, oh yeah, I just want to talk to you about this project, and there's just a thing that came up with it, and if you could cover that, that'd be awesome. I'm like, oh yeah, I can totally do that. And meanwhile, I'm like drenched in sweat and dealing with that. But that's kind of what it's like. Somebody told me this, a friend of mine said, I find the challenge to be explaining to folks how it's not like their anxiety about a job interview or like Mondays where you're kind of like, I really don't want to get up. I'm kind of nervous about getting back to that. Or, I've had sort of normal things that are stressy kinds of things like selling a house or like some other big life events that it's like, oh, there's a lot of stuff. Like if I screw this up, that could be really kind of financially bad or things like that. But, so for me, what happens is that when I deal with that kind of stuff, I'm really stressed out like this. And then so it's sort of like my baseline, like anxiety level it's kind of like I'm having a stress reaction, a low level stress reaction constantly. And when there's something where I'm not familiar with stuff, I tend to have a much higher stress reaction because I'm acutely afraid that something could go wrong. And that is how I felt like the 2 hours before this, I felt acutely afraid that something could go wrong, even though I know everything's going to be fine. But I'm here and I don't really know this place and stuff like that. And so I get really freaked out. So if there's something that is a major event, that can be horribly traumatic. And it's not just internal. Obviously, if you're feeling that way, that affects all the people around me too. There are consequences for how I'm acting and how I'm feeling and how I'm reacting to stuff that impacts everybody else around me, all the people I care about and stuff like that. Because if you feel like that all the time, you tend to be kind of a dick, and or because you're scared and you act. A lot of times when I'm scared, the way that I react with that is anger or frustration or things like that. Yeah. So I've had physical manifestations of that. Like talks about for me the anxiety is it's like, oh well, it's just all in your mind. But actually what's going on is it's releasing stress hormones. I think cortisol is the thing it releases in your body, and your brain tells your body to release that, and so you're actually going through physical stuff, and that's what's causing all these things to happen. So you have physical manifestations of that. I talked about like this knot that I feel in my chest, and it's not over here. It's not with my heart. It's like right here. Let's see. After starting in college, do people know what IBS is? All right. Okay. Yeah, it's a fun thing to talk about. I dealt with that from college until I was probably about 27 or 28. And so it got to the point where I was afraid to be more than 10 minutes away from a bathroom at any given time, which it doesn't exactly, I wouldn't call that an agoraphobia, but it effectively makes it so that I never want to leave places that I feel safe at. And so because I'm scared that I'm going to shit my pants, right? And so you can imagine that also that, of course, makes you want to shit your pants when you feel that way. And so that's a cool feedback loop that you get. So I'd be like driving along on the road, and like if I was riding with somebody else, we had to drive. Let's say we had to drive half an hour, like some horribly long trip like that, and I'd be literally like pale, white knuckling it along the road. And if somebody's sitting next to me and they're like, "Hey man, are you okay? You all right?" I'm like, "Yeah, all right. I'm just trying not to fart constantly." But yeah, and so I for one reason or another, that has gotten better. It doesn't manifest that way for me anymore, thankfully. But that was something I dealt with, and that was a direct line connected to these stress reactions, right? That was triggered by that stuff and fed into it too. That really sucked. For me, I have a lot of difficulty with like intensity of emotion, and for me, like if I get upset about something or I get or something bothers me and something kind of triggers me. It's very frustrating because a lot of times it can be a trigger can be something that just sort of comes on and I don't think about it. But I talked about like if I'm thinking about one thing and then somebody comes up to me and says, "Hey, could you do this for me?" It's often very, very difficult for me, and I feel very frustrated because I'm really focused on this thing right now, and now suddenly they want me to. They're trying to pull me in a different direction. I'm like, I do not want to let go of that, and it's hard because it's very frustrating, and I'm starting to get better at it because I'm seeing a therapist about some stuff to help with these things. But a lot of times, the intensity of the emotion is what's so difficult. Is that it kind of comes on like a wave, and I feel like I don't really have good control over it. I don't feel like I have. I don't feel like I have control really over what I'm going to say. So what I tend to do is I really kind of like shut down and don't talk. And because I'm afraid of what I'm going to say and how it's going to affect the people around me. And so I kind of have to let it like ride out. I have to ride this wave out and just let it stop. And sometimes I just have to kind of separate myself, or I just have to be quiet. And that's tough because then, of course, people around me are like, I'm afraid to say things to you because I'm afraid it'll piss you off if I say the wrong thing. But that kind of sucks. For me, it can make, like, it comes on so strong, it can make your best friends, like, feel like enemies to you. It's like, why the fuck do they say that stuff to me? It just really pisses you off. And it can make everything seem that you enjoy normally when it's really, really bad. It can make all that stuff that logically is great and wonderful, and the people you care about and the things that you like, it can make all that seem useless and empty. And that really sucks. That's really, really tough. And the tough thing is not feeling like you have control over it, because logically it's not like that. But the problem is that you feel this way, and there's not any way you feel like you can turn that off. You don't know exactly how to turn it off. I talked about that I have problems focusing too. That can be a difficult thing sometimes with, like if I'm trying to do work, and it used to be, especially before I was taking medication for it, I would have like a week where I just didn't do anything. It's like, hey, I'm just going to browse RSS feed for a week instead of actually doing any work. It's better now. Usually, it might have like sort of a bad half a day, and that's gotten a lot better. I think for partly the medication and partly I'm sort of better at dealing with that. But I also have these spiraling chains of thought, and that's a tough thing. But I talked about this scenario, like the way that I build a scenario really quickly. So I construct negative outcomes really fast. Like I think about, like I was talking about, it's like, okay, the boss wants to talk to me, and then like in 5 minutes, I'm like, we're going to be homeless. That is like, I get from there to there really, really quickly. And that's a tough thing, because it ends up turning every little minor thing that really you should not worry about into a life-altering event. You're fearful that it's a life-altering event. And when you do that, you end up spending all this time in the future. You're constantly worried about the future. You're always thinking about the future. And that's not good. You're not present. You're not centered. You're not just kind of, this is what I got control over now. Because because I can't predict that. I don't know that outcome's going to happen. And I can't control it, but it just sits there. And all I can do is worry about it, right? And then sort of the opposite direction, I tend to obsess on negative events that have happened. So like a conflict is really upsetting to me. I don't like doing that. I find it really painful. And I'm also the kind of person that sometimes I feel like, well, there's a certain sense of right and wrong, and I feel like there's things that I should talk about that are important, and I should stand up for people if I felt like that they're being treated badly or things like that. At the same time, I find it deeply uncomfortable to be in conflict, and I know that there's some things that I'm going to get myself into where there's going to be people who react badly to that. I think that is the entire basis of Twitter. And even things long in the past where I did something wrong, or I felt guilty about it. In third grade, now I'm 38 years old. In third grade, I had a spelling workbook that I had to work on, and I didn't work on it for most of the year. I was this kid who I was just kind of good enough to figure out, like I could just get by and do well in school, and I was in these gifted classes and shit like that. And I was good enough, I guess, just so that I did not really have to work at anything in elementary school. And so things that involve stuff like homework or trying to, like some level of discipline, I just had no ability to do that. I never learned how to do that. And I know now that I probably had ADD as a child, and of course I wasn't diagnosed until I was 27. So I didn't do this spelling homework that I was supposed to do like every week or something like that for basically the entire school year. And then there was like a week left, and it's like you got to turn in your work at the end of the year. And I didn't have any of it done. It was like it's like 100 pages of spelling stuff, and I didn't have any of it done. There was no way I was going to get it done, and I was terrified. And it was and I remember it ended up okay, and it's like I got like a C in spelling for that, and it's okay. Well, I knew how to spell okay probably, but because I didn't do the work, I got a C, and that turned out okay. And realistically, not a big deal. Just move past it, right? That's fine. Now, for probably 15 years later, I felt like shit about that. Like I would think about it and feel shitty, and I couldn't let go of it because I felt like I just couldn't let go of that. I still held on to it. I still held on to that screw up that I had. Why? I don't know. Some sense of like appropriate. I grew up Catholic guilt. I don't know. Some sense that I needed to hold on to that because that motivated me to get to actually do things properly because I remember what it felt like. I don't know, but that was really sucky. And to hold on to things like that, I still do that. I still go back and I think to myself, like something I did 3 or 4 months ago, and I think to myself, I feel really, really bad about that. And it wasn't something. It was just it was a thing that was like, maybe I had a minor conflict with a friend or something like that. We talked it out. Everything's fine. That person, it doesn't bother them, but it's still like I think of it and it twinges, like it triggers a guilt in me. It triggers embarrassment in me, and it's hard to let go of that. I, for one reason or another, have trained myself not to do that. I don't know exactly why. That's why I'm working with a therapist again. But I can't let go of that stuff. And I think the thing that's hardest when you deal with that is this feeling that you're alone and that you're not like anybody else. And I felt that way for a really, really, really long time. I felt that way certainly through all of high school. I started feeling that way in junior high. I had a really, really bad junior high experience. I had switched schools. I was bullied a lot. I went into an adolescent psychiatric hospital on an inpatient basis for 2 months. I was away from home. So all of high school, although I had support, like the high school that I went to a different high school, and they were very supportive in a lot of ways. It was the place I needed to be, and that's great, but I still didn't feel like anybody really understood. I didn't feel like I had anybody to talk to who sort of understood these things. And I felt like I was the only person who was really like this. And I felt like I was broken and I wasn't ever going to be right. And that was just the worst feeling in the world. To feel like fundamentally there's something wrong with you and you cannot cope in society, that you don't work in this world, and that as a consequence, stuff is always going to go badly. And that feeling of separation, that people don't really understand what you're going through, it's loneliness, as close as you can be. I know that I can be in the middle of a room with like 100 people and I can feel incredibly lonely and disconnected from everybody. And I feel that way because I feel like I'm very conscious of who I am, and I feel like I do not have a connection with anybody else. And that's gotten better. It's gotten better as I've talked about this stuff. It's gotten better. I've kind of learned to be more open. I've learned that no, it's actually pretty common. There's lots of people like me. But I felt that way until probably I was 30 years old. And that sometimes turned to stuff like suicidal ideation, which is just thinking about doing something like that. And I still have that, even though I've dealt with it a lot less. I still, in very stressful events, or if I feel very guilty, or if I feel very like I've really screwed up, I still have ideation. I still have this ideas of, it just pops into my head and I can't let it go. It's this repetitive thing. I think of it over and over and over. Now, and I dealt with when I was a teenager and later, into my 20s. I also did things like self-mutilation. And for me, I don't know what it's like for other people. I don't know exactly why they do it for other people. Other people have different experiences. I don't know what. But for me, I didn't know how to talk about this stuff. So if I would do things to my skin, or I'd cut myself or something like that, it was me trying to express somehow how I felt and what it was like for me, because I didn't know a different way of doing it, and which is deeply screwed up. That I felt so disconnected from people that I felt like the words were not adequate, that I could not explain how intense I felt and how disconnected I felt and how upset and sad and utterly broken that I felt. And so, I mean, I still look at it every day. I've still got stuff that I did to myself when I was 13, and you probably can't see it, but I can. I mean, I can see where I did stuff, and things later too, still on my hands and my arms and shit like that. And it reminds me of like what that was like, and how it's. I feel better most of the time now. Things are better, but it still comes back sometimes. It's still sometimes I feel like that. For me, like actual suicidal stuff was kind of rare. And it really kind of only happened in a couple times in really very, very intense emotional situations. The worst thing for me was I got in a big fight with my partner at the time, and it's funny because it wasn't a feeling of like sadness. It was a feeling of I do not give a shit what happens anymore. And that's a tough place to be, because you're conscious of the fact that what you're doing is very destructive. But you just don't care. And that's a really, really tough place to be, because you know logically this is going to screw a lot of things up. This is going to badly affect relationships. This is going to cause lasting problems. But I sometimes get to this point, thankfully not very often, but sometimes have gotten to this point where it's like you push through this threshold where the anxiety and the anger and the frustration gets to a point where you just want to destroy everything. And you want to destroy all the things around you, and you want to, and you just don't care anymore. And I remember feeling that way and barricading myself in the bathroom and taking a bunch of pills and shoving them in my mouth and sitting there while I felt my partner trying to kick down the door, and she couldn't get through because she wasn't strong enough. And I just couldn't do it. I couldn't take a bottle of water and drink it all. And I couldn't do it it was really because of my like 1.5-year-old son who was out there too. But I think if I didn't have that, I don't know what I would have done, because otherwise I don't think anything else was keeping me there. And that was a really, really bad place. The tough thing is that this kind of stuff, this anxiety, this depression, this feeling of loneliness, this feeling of disconnection, and I think the anxiety and the depression, those things, those are really, really tough, and those really, really suck. But the fact that we feel so disconnected from each other, the fact that we feel like there aren't any options, and that we're having an abnormal thing that is not, that we're not, that there's something wrong with us, and that we're not trying hard enough, and we can't ever seem to try hard enough and get our shit together, and things always go badly, and we just think it's never going to work. All that stuff, the problem is that it's going to kill you one way or another. It doesn't just happen where, because I deal with anxiety all the time, or I deal with depression all the time, well then ultimately there's certainly some people who take their own lives. But the problem is that even if that doesn't happen, there's a good chance you're going to die sooner because of it. There's a lot of decent evidence that depression and anxiety actually raise your mortality rate. And they don't just, so it's not just a matter of, say, suicide. There's a good article in the New Republic, and it's a link there, and you can get my slides later. But there's a quote. This is a quote from that emotional isolation is ranked as higher risk factor for mortality as smoking. So it's interesting. You think about that, and just think about like that feeling of disconnection, that feeling of feeling like people don't understand you, and that there's just something wrong with you, and that you can't relate to other people. That feeling of being disconnected from a community is just that destructive, and that it weighs on you. The fact that your body is constantly kicking out, stress hormones and stuff like that. Well, it's not supposed to work like that all the time, and that actually has a real impact on like the way your immune system works and stuff like that. In that same article, it talked about how, I think it was a study that was done in like the mid-90s. I have to go back and look at it again, but you can go read it if you want to. But it did, this is one study, so you got to take it with a grain of salt. But it did a comparison and it tracked men who had HIV, gay men who had HIV. And so it tracked closeted men who were not openly gay, and then men who are. And I found that closeted men with HIV on an average died 2 to 3 years sooner than men who are not. There's a guy, Robert Sapolsky, who's a professor at Stanford, and who did a really good talk. I'd suggest checking out if you can. There's a YouTube link on it. And he says in that lecture he gave, that depression is the worst disease that you can get. And from that, a couple things from that the World Health Organization has depression as the number 4 cause of disability in the world. But the problem is that we think of it as we're not willing to even talk about it. And a lot of times we have family members, or we have friends, or we have colleagues, or we have our workplace environment telling us that, oh, we're just being lazy. Or that, hey, dude, it's cool, don't worry about it. Just try not to worry about it and it'll be fine. But it's not just that you're being lazy. Your body is actually having a severe stress response, and that's what you're going through. But you're going through it constantly. But we're afraid to talk about it. We're afraid to bring that up with somebody because there's this huge stigma about it. Now, there's not a stigma about something like diabetes. There's not a stigma about cancer. There's not a stigma about high cholesterol. There's not a stigma about heart disease. But there's a stigma about this. And I would say that our understanding of many psychological issues is not on the same level as maybe some things that we think are just, these are just physical things. At the same time, they're still treatable if we're willing to go seek out the help. But our culture tells us that it's not the same, that we really shouldn't do that, it's not really okay to talk about it, and it keeps us scared. And that really sucks. And that puts us in a really tough place because it's really, really rough and it's demoralizing, and you think, what am I going to do about this? And I think the point is that we really can't stay silent about this stuff. And that's the problem. There are things that you can do to get help. There are lots of ways that we can get help. And there's lots of things we can do to try to increase awareness of this stuff. But we have to not be scared of talking about it. We have to realize that it's okay. And that's the tough thing. And I think we fight it by talking about it. We don't hide it. We don't hide from it, and there's, no more hiding and no more shame and no more fear about that. You take that away, mental health becomes it doesn't solve the problem, but it is much harder to deal with it, and it is much more debilitating because of the fact that we're not willing to talk about it. And that's what divides us and disconnects us. Is that feeling, that loneliness, that feeling of being broken. The reason I felt like I wasn't like anybody else, and that I felt like there was something wrong with me, and that nobody else was like me, was because people were scared to talk about it. And we thought that that was just kind of maybe part of life, and that life was kind of shitty sometimes, and you just kind of suffered through it. And maybe you just need to buck up and deal with it. And that's the kind of, I didn't have people necessarily telling me that directly. I've known people who've said they've had, say, family or friends or things like that tell them that kind of bullshit directly. But I certainly had it, that was sort of the underlying thing. It was that, sometimes it's just kind of tough and you just kind of have to deal with it, right? And so that was tough. That's what disconnects us. We need that connection. We need to know that it's okay to talk about this. We need to know that there are other people like us. And we need to be okay to say, yeah, this is something I deal with. Just like, I can't see shit right now, right? And that's okay, and there's nothing wrong with it. And I can wear this on my face, and it's not some kind of fucking cone of shame that a dog has to wear, right? This is normal. Lots of people deal with it. It's okay. And sometimes I worry about this, and I worry about appropriating it. But there's a thing that came up with ACT UP New York, came up with in the middle of the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and they had this. There's a sign, a famous sign that says "Silence equals death," and it might not be as directly mortality isn't as directly connected. It's not as fast, but not talking about this shit, that kills people. It slowly kills people. They slowly hurt and suffer and are more and more disconnected, and they die sooner, or something tragic happens and they die way, way, way too young because we're not willing to talk about this stuff. Because we're not willing to say, no, it's okay, it's normal. We're not just being lazy. This is something that some people deal with, and it's okay. So, to transition out of that very poorly, I wanted to talk about it. Now, how many of you here are a bunch of nerds who do programming, stuff like that? All right, so a lot of you, that's cool. You don't all have to be. It's not just about that. But, I mean, I talk about it from the perspective of being a developer because that's what I am and that's what I do. And so I sort of know about it from that perspective, so I'll talk about that a little bit. The funny thing is there's actually some certain positives in having the kinds of, personality traits, let's call them that, as opposed to horrible, horrible disorders. So one of the things I'm good at, people are pattern matching machines. We recognize faces and we see things, it's like, okay, that face on Mars? Well, it's not a fucking face on Mars. It's just, it looks like a face, so we think it's a face because that's the way that our brains work. Right? So we're really good at pattern matching. We recognize certain things. Our brains are trigger that way. And that's one of the things that human brains do really well. And I tend to be kind of good at that. I tend to be good at seeing like, oh, that pattern reminds me of this old pattern over here, so maybe we can apply the stuff we learned here to that. So that's good for problem solving. I'm not a particularly good, if you talk to me about being like a CS programmer or knowing stuff about like sophisticated theorems or things like that in computer science, I would simply embarrass myself because I'm terrible at that. But I'm pretty good at solving problems with this kind of stuff, and that that's really helpful. I'm good at anticipating potential outcomes quickly, particularly negative ones, which is helpful. If you are dealing with, say, security issues. And I spent 9 or 10 years dealing with security stuff at Purdue University, and that was a big part of what I did. So, and when you're building applications that human beings interact with, you have to be conscious of those kinds of things because they might do things that try to break it or steal data out of it or things like that. And I'm pretty good at anticipating those things. I'm not always great. Some other, I don't catch everything, but I'm pretty good at it. Pretty good at saying, okay, well, if we do this, these are the things we need to think about because this could happen, and then suddenly we're getting sued because we lost all the credit card information. And I think I'm pretty good at being, because I'm so excited about running into somebody who maybe I sort of understand where they're coming from, I'm pretty good at being like an empathetic and supportive colleague, I think, or a friend or whatever that. And I get a lot of reward out of helping others. That makes me feel really good. And so that's one of the reasons I do this, is because I feel like there's some people out here who kind of understand it. And when I have talked about it, there's lots of people who say, oh, yes, I'm like that too. Or, yes, I know people who are like that too. And that's really rewarding for me to be able to do that. And that sort of empathy that I have, not sort of, it is, I guess I'm kind of good at being empathetic, is that I have good empathy for users and the people who are going to interact with, say, the applications that I build. And that's something that a lot of times programmers aren't great at, is having empathy, and particularly putting themselves in the position of someone who is not like them. I'm not great at it, but if you ever want to learn how little you know about being what it's like to not be a developer type, watch a 5-year-old try to use a mouse and keyboard. We think to ourselves, oh, yes, I swear to God, all the time, I'm like, oh, that's very intuitive. I hear people say, oh, that's an intuitive interface. No, it isn't. You just learned how to use it. And if you ever see somebody who didn't learn how to do that stuff, that crap is hard. It does not make sense. What, I'm moving this thing around and it makes a thing move around here? What is that? How does that relate? There's a big disconnect between those things. So I have problems with that a lot of times, but I try to put myself in that position and think about what it's like to deal with that stuff. And I think maybe my openness to being empathetic to people helps a lot. I think so. I think I have that tendency because I have felt oftentimes disconnected from people. So I really try to not have that with other folks. One of the things that's tough for me is I don't know how many guys or how many of you folks say if any of you work remotely. I work remotely and I have for like 4 years. So there's a big difference between working in person and remote. And a lot of times, like, for example, if I spend a lot of time just working at home, and I'll run into people who work at home, and they're just like, yeah, I just haven't left the house for like 6 weeks. I can't do that because I start feeling kind of crappy about myself if I don't interact with people, if I don't get out of the house, so I end up going to a coffee shop and I'll work there, or we just had a new co-working space open up where I live, so I go to that and I run into other people, and most of the time I'm just by myself, but I have chances, I'm sort of around people, and that helps me. That gives me a little bit of a social connection that I lack if I'm just at home. So I kind of need that, right? There's a lot of stuff you run into in terms of communication. You learn that, well, I guess I knew this very well since ever I got on Usenet when I was in college in like 1994, that there's a lot of things that get lost in text-only communication, and so it's really easy to get into a giant fight that way. So if anybody remembers news groups, they do still exist, and just imagine Twitter, but kind of slower. And with more words, like you can post more words. So it's like that, and the lack of nonverbal communication is really problematic. It's really easy, particularly if you're the kind of person like me who is like, assumes the absolute worst case scenario when somebody tells you something, that it's really, really hard then if you're having an interaction to not think like, oh, this person now hates me and thinks I did something super stupid and maybe they were just pointing out something. It's like, oh, you know what, you could have done this. No, I'm an idiot. Fuck you. Starts a big thing. It really helps in working with teams and working with groups that I have colleagues and say project managers or managers or bosses or things like that who are really understanding of what that I go through. And I've been pretty lucky in that most of the time I've had folks who are understanding. Even if they didn't really get what I was going through, they tried to help me out, and that was good, and I'm glad. There's some people who are not as lucky and don't have those kinds of things. That's a problem. But for me, those are some of the things I deal with. I go to a lot of conferences, and I work in open source a lot, and I try to contribute to open source stuff, and I try to open source a lot of my code, and I go and give talks. I used to give a lot of technical talks. Mostly I talk about this crap now. But one of the things that I find is that you go to a lot of tech conferences, and a lot of times the way that, and I guess they figure because most people, they think that they'll show up to this party because there's free alcohol. So sponsors put together these big things with these loud parties with a bunch of free alcohol. And that is kind of like the worst possible scenario for me. I really don't want to be there. I find that to be sort of a hellscape. is really, really deeply unpleasant for me to. I can probably spend about 20 minutes in there, and then I realize that like I can't hear anybody and I can't talk to anybody, and they're getting progressively more drunk and acting like idiots. So why am I here? Like, what is fun about that? I don't know. So I don't know. I never go to that stuff. I find it not fun. I mean, I guess if other people find it fun, that's cool. But kind of, it's sort of a bummer to me that that's sort of like the default go-to of like how to get people excited about your product. Well, throw a bunch of free booze at them. Well, okay, I guess that's an option. Maybe try talking to them and telling them what's good about it. But another thing for me is that travel's actually really scary. And it's not like flying isn't hard for me. I don't have a problem with flying. I get on a plane, I'm fine. I'm like, it's great. But for me, what it is like, it's all the preparation and the fear that of all the things that I could do wrong, possibly, I have to get everything, like I have to pack everything right, and I have to make sure that all my stuff's there, and if my stuff isn't there, well, I've got medicine, and I've got this thing, and I've got to have a power supply, and I've got to have my laptop, and I've got to have all this stuff. And if one of those things goes wrong, I'm screwed and the whole thing's over. I'm fucked. And that's really, really tough for me. So I get really freaked out about travel, particularly plane travel, because it's one of those things where it's like you've got a certain window, a very small window of being there at the right time. And if you're not there at the right time with all the stuff that you need, something could go wrong and, go crazy. And so, of course, I have this tendency to anticipate the worst possible outcomes and, that's a tough thing. And for me, it's always tough being in a new place where I don't really know people, and that's really scary for me. Like, it's scary because I don't really know how to get around like this town right now, so I need somebody to help me out because I don't. It's kind of intimidating. It's almost paralyzing for me to like deal with that. And if I don't have that person who's going to kind of help me out, it's really tough, and I'm like freaked out the whole time because I feel like I don't know what to do. I don't like. I'm the kind of person who's like. Presented with the option, let's say, of public transportation and getting on a bus. And remember, I live in Indiana, where public transportation is sinful, and so I'm used to driving most places, and that's sort of how everything is put together in my town. It's about 100,000 people, college town, but you drive everywhere. So I presented like with like me on my own without having some sort of like buddy system going on. Like if I have to get on a bus, that is terrifying to me because the things I'm thinking about, basically the big thing is that, and I haven't talked about this, but walking into a scenario that I don't know and there's a bunch of people around is really, really scary for me because I'm terrified that I'm going to embarrass myself. I feel like everybody's looking at me and I'm going to be like, I don't know I only have a credit card or I've only got a $20 bill and what if they don't take my $20 bill? And I don't know. So I'm just like, fuck it, I'm not going to take the bus. I will just pay the $75 for the cab ride and just do it. And I do. I absolutely I would just rather do that because it's much easier for me. I know how to operate a cab. Here is money. Drive me to the place. I just need to know the address. Here's the information. Just get me there. That's fine. And I appear, and it's great. A bus, it's like I have done things like because I got so freaked out about that whether I was going to get off at the right place or not. In full knowledge that this was not the right stop, got off like 3 stops early because I'm just like I can't handle this shit. I'm out. And I'm downtown Portland in the middle of midnight. And if you don't know, there's nothing going on in the middle of Portland at midnight. It all shuts down. So I had to call a taxi. Should have just done that in the first place. But that's, it just gets so tense that I'm like, oh shit, I'm going to freak out. Now, if I do it several times, I kind of get more familiar with it. But that's always been a tough thing for me, is that sort of getting around. And I know people who speak at tech conferences. I speak at a lot of PHP conferences, and I know these folks who they are like, hey, I'm just going to explore the city. And they're like getting out and just going on their own and walking around. I almost pulled that thing out. They're walking around and going to places and stuff like. I don't understand how these people do these things. I would end up, I know I'm going to end up lost and freaked out and just like be in a fetal position on the sidewalk. And that's just how I feel. So I'm deeply uncomfortable with that. Even though I know logically I could just ask somebody, how do I do this? And the times when I actually get the guts up for doing that, no, of course it turns out fine. Of course it's all fine. But I don't feel that way. I'm terrified. I'm terrified. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to screw up. I'm embarrassed, and it just goes to crap. So thankfully I have understanding people, or I have friends who help me out with stuff or things like that. But as much as I really enjoy doing like these talks and I find it really rewarding, it's also kind of tough, right? It's kind of hard to get those things out. So I want to talk a little bit about techniques and the ways that I kind of mitigate this stuff. I mean, one of the things that I'll say is that there's very clearly, I say I'm not an expert, but I know this. People will come up to you and say, oh, you know what, if you just do this, then you're not going to be depressed. Or, you do this, and that's going to solve your problems. Maybe you should just exercise, and that'll take care of it. It worked for me, and I drink a bunch of water, and that worked for me, and that should work for you too. And that is horse shit. It does not work that way. It's just not true. Now, there's some things, every person's, you can find different situations. There's some things that work for a large number of people, but we do not have the understanding where we can be like, oh, well, this is the issue right here, and we're going to pinpoint it, and that will solve your problem. The way that we can with a lot of other diseases. We don't have that same kind of thing that we do with mental illness. So there's lots of different things that people work with, and it helps some people, and it doesn't help other people. Now, one of the things that is kind of a tangent a little bit, but I kind of feel like most people self-medicate, and I think that that's just the way that we do. And I think we do it mostly in socially acceptable ways. I think alcohol is the most common. I talk to developers all the time, and who are like, yeah, man, I'm really stressed out. I can't wait to have a drink, or like, let's get some whiskey or something like that, or they have fucking like a beer night, or they, at the office, which is, I cannot imagine that. It seems ridiculous to me, and I do not know why you would introduce that into your workplace, but I guess that just seems like a really bad idea. I mean, if you want to run your company like a frat house, go for it. But alcohol's the most common. But you do things like cigarettes and coffee, and caffeine's like the most commonly used drug in the world. I mean, but that's what it is. And everything that we ingest has an impact on the chemical balances that we have. So it impacts our mood, it impacts how we feel, it impacts our energy levels, it impacts all sorts of things. So we use those socially acceptable tools, and we don't think about it that way. We don't think that it's like I'm taking a drug right now, but that's exactly what you're doing. You're doing the exact same thing. It's just these are socially acceptable ones that maybe have less impact on you health-wise. And these are not socially acceptable ones, some of which may be perfectly normal and don't have much health impact on you. But for one reason or another, because let's say we wanted to punish Mexicans who were coming over the borders in the early 1900s, we outlawed them, like marijuana or things like that. Personally, I think that most illegal drug users are self-medicating. I don't think most people start doing that stuff because it's like, hey, I really want to get addicted to opiates. I think most people use it, and they keep using it because it makes them feel better, and probably because they felt kind of shitty. And so most people who feel great and are generally okay don't feel the need to dramatically alter their mood. But if you feel like you are constantly anxious or upset or depressed or trying to escape from what is a generally painful existence, well, no wonder you want to use that kind of stuff. I will now get off my soapbox about the war on drugs. I self-medicate with food. Food makes me feel better. I love eating food, and it makes me feel good, and certain foods make me feel really good, like chocolate. I really like chocolate, and I will eat it, and it makes me feel better, and it often calms me down, and that's great. If you put an amount of ice cream, no matter what amount that is, in front of me, I will consume that amount. That's what happens. Whatever that is, that I will finish it. So I kind of have to be careful of that. That is one thing, and that's not good for me. That has a serious health impact on me. So I have to be kind of careful with that. But I definitely self-medicate with food. Absolutely. So, there's all sorts of coping mechanisms that everybody uses every day, right? To calm themselves down or feel better about what's going on in our lives. Now, for me, like for the stuff that, like, if I'm actually trying to help things as opposed to just sort of, cover things up, I think the biggest thing is I really don't like to tell people, oh, this is what you should do to solve your problems. But the biggest thing I guess, when people ask me, like, I don't know where to go because I'm scared and I don't understand how to do this and I'm freaked out about it, I always say, I think what you should do is try to find a therapist because I think you should talk about what's going on. And I really feel strongly that for anybody who wants to start dealing with the problems that they have and actively try to figure out what's going on, you need to be talking with somebody who's professionally trained and figure that out with them. And I emphasize the with them part. You don't go there to have them tell you what's wrong with you. It doesn't work that way because we don't really understand these things that well. You need to figure it out with them. So, in some cases, depression or anxiety is really is a symptom of either certain emotional issues that are going on, maybe emotional trauma you've had or something like that, or it can be physical issues too. It can be, I've run into people who talked about that they had serious issues with depression, dealt with it for 10 years. Oh, then it turns out they did the right test and it was a thyroid disorder that was causing it. Oh, yeah, because what happens is it releases different hormones in your body and it's constantly releasing this thing that triggers depressive states. And all these things that go along with depression, like motor retardation and things like that. No, those are actually real things. It's not just like your brain is bummed out. Your body is actually in a different physical state. The chemical balances are different. And so that Sapolsky talk, that guy from Stanford, he talks about in that lecture that, he says, okay, we have this good understanding. We feel like what kind is going on with the biological stuff of depression. I'm kind of careful about that because they said that in the 70s too, and then they were wrong. But he said, okay, we know serotonin, we can increase the levels of it we give people these drugs and it seems to increase it and stuff like that. And okay, we got a good feel for it, and that seems like, hey, we're in good shape, right? Well, it turns out that if you only treat the biological, the chemical stuff, that helps about 30% of people. So there's a very clear, like, other stuff going on thing, and our understanding of like the interaction between the brain and our mental state and how that impacts our physical state is not great compared to understanding of a lot of other systems in the body. So that's why I always say you need to figure out what's going on first, and you need to figure out, like, well, could it be this? Let's talk about that. Could it be this? We need to talk about that. How do you feel about this? What are the kinds of things that trigger it? And that's actively taking a part of that. And the reason why I really emphasize therapy is because I think that if you go and you just say, I'm going to, look at medicine, and I'm just going to, the very most common thing that I hear is people will say, hey, I'm dealing with this stuff. And at least they go out and try to get help. But what they do is they go to a general practitioner and they talk to them about their issues. And general practitioners do what general practitioners are trained to do, which is to give you some kind of pill or other clearly defined treatment that will solve your problem. So they give you a medicine, and that's how they deal with things. That's how they know to deal with things. They are not trained in psychological disorders. That is not what they do. So if you're going to a general practitioner, the best thing that they can do is they give you a referral to somebody who can actually help you. And so the general practitioners I know who are smart, that's what they do. Now, in some cases, maybe all you need is you take an SSRI, and sometimes you take that for a while, and that helps the person, and then they work past it, they don't need the medication anymore, and it works great. And that's fine. If that works for you, that is awesome. But if we're going by what Sapolsky said, now that's not going to work for 70% of the people who deal with these issues. So there's a good chance that you're not dealing with the issues. You're not really, treating what's actually going on. You're just kind of covering up symptoms. So that's why I really emphasize that. Now, I think it's very typical and probably a good idea to, you may find that you want to take medicine in addition to seeing a therapist, and that's very common, and I think that's a great idea. You may find that medicine is what you need, and that's all you need, and that's what you need to cope with this on a day-to-day basis. But the key thing is that not to just rely on that, I guess. For me, I think it's really important to just coping skill stuff is like avoiding triggers things that I know that are going to be an issue. I think it's important to kind of shut things off for a while. A lot of times, like I talked about this intense emotion I have, and shutting those things down is really important. And like I edit my Etsy host file on my computer so that I cannot go to certain websites or social media services because it will just make me mad. And particularly if I'm in some kind of conflict thing and I'm upset about it. But the funny thing is, I hate conflict, but I cannot keep myself away from it. I keep wanting to check it and check it. Oh, motherfuckers. So I have to disconnect myself, and I really have to force myself to do that. So if I don't do that, I will get into a very bad self-destructive repetitive pattern where I keep feeding myself stuff that is triggering me. So I have to find that trigger and cut it off for a while because I'm not in a place to deal with it in a productive way. I find that crying is actually really helpful. A lot of times I get really frustrated, really pissed off, and if I can get myself to a point where I realize that what I am is I'm scared, and I'm just very emotional, and I cry, I feel 100 times better somehow magically. So that idea that for me, a lot of times anger is really it's a reaction to that fear and anxiety that I have, and crying seems to relieve that. So I'm cool with that. I'm a man who embraces my crying, I guess. And all the social stigma that might come along with that, but that is totally okay and normal, and shit, that's fine with me. It works. Just finding things that give you some kind of comfort that calm you down. Like I have little things like if I'm wearing a hoodie, or if I put my hood up, or I put a hat on, somehow that calms me down. I don't exactly know why. There's probably some psychological connection between feeling pressure on my head and feeling safe. I don't know why. I could probably get into some weird stuff with that, but totally works. A lot of people with autistic spectrum disorders, I know a thing you'll see about is that I remember seeing this thing about a woman who I guess she would say she was high level, like dealing with stuff. Like she seemed to have a relatively normal life, but she had an autistic disorder, and she would do this thing where there's some kind of thing that it was like a harness that they'd put cows in, and it would kind of hold them up in the air or something. Yeah, sure. Let's just call it a cattle press. I assume that's a real thing. She might have just made that up. If she felt that, she would get in that thing and would feel that pressure, and that would relieve all this like overwhelming crap, all this anxiety and stuff that is hard. People talk about that autistics in some ways, maybe that what they are is that they don't have filters to sort of shut off incoming data and incoming stimuli. And that calmed her down dramatically. Just that physical act of being held in that pressure. And I could kind of dig that. I sort of feel that way too sometimes. For me, like listening to things that is something that's safe and that I do not have any vested interest in, like if I listen to like a podcast, like a comedy podcast, or I listen to like sports radio or something like that, that is really, really helpful for me. It just is, because it's not something I have to stress about. If it's about like tech, I don't listen to any tech podcasts. I do a tech podcast and I don't listen to any of them. It's called Development Hell. You should subscribe to it now. Yeah, thank you. I actively avoid those things because I don't want. It's like I want to have something that calms me down, and I don't want to get riled up about something, or I don't want to think about this stuff. It's not good. Talking to trusted people if I'm really upset, that helps me a lot. If I can talk to somebody, somebody who I feel safe talking to. And then the last thing is hugs. I really like hugs. People don't hug enough, I think. And I understand that you don't want somebody to be creepy, but I really like hugs. They make me feel a lot better, and they make me feel connected to a person. There's something in that for me that feels like there's a connection of empathy there that for someone who has so often felt disconnected, that is very, very comforting to me. So to me, that's really cool, and I like giving hugs to people, and because I feel like those connections are important. For me, it's like making a social connection with somebody, so I like that. All right, I know this is taking a long time, and normally I don't take this much time to do the talk, but it give me 2 hours, so I'm going to just fill it. But so I was going to talk a little bit about helping friends and coworkers, and I'll try to wrap up after that. I think it varies for everyone. I'm not an expert in this stuff, so I'm not going to tell you, oh, do this, this, and this. But this is Seattle, right? And Microsoft is near here, looming, always watching. Does anybody here remember that video of Steve Ballmer talking about developers and developers? His armpits are all sweaty. Developers. This man was a CEO. So how does that happen? Well, empathy, I think. Empathy. That is the most important thing. There is nothing more important than empathy. And to be clear, empathy is trying to understand what it is like to be somebody who's not you and what it is like for them in their situation and trying to put yourself in that situation and know what it is like. That is not a thing that you immediately can do. It is something that you constantly have to practice. Some people sort of out of the gate seem to be better at it than others, but I constantly have to practice that, and I constantly have to work to feel empathy, particularly for people who I think are dicks or something like that. But by doing that, there's just nothing more important than if you want to try to help people who are around you who are struggling with this stuff, that's the key. It is empathy. But to go along with that, I think it's really key to help people feel safe. If you know somebody who's dealing with this kind of stuff, help them feel safe. Because culturally, they're basically told that they shouldn't feel safe. That it's not okay what they're going through. That there's something they're doing that's wrong. And if you just listen to them and understand what it's like for them, practice that empathy with them, that is going to make them feel much more comfortable dealing with this stuff. A key thing I know for me is that I am very frustrated by the fact that I behave this way, and it is embarrassing to me. It is in many ways shameful for me, and I am deeply frustrated by the fact that I behave in ways that I know are not helpful and not constructive. And I think it's really key to acknowledge that because I don't think anybody really wants to feel this way, and they're not sort of okay with that, and understand that they're probably very frustrated with how they feel and behave. And that's why it's really key, I think, to be understanding and just listen, not try to tell them what to do, not try to tell them how to fix things. And know that, particularly for people who have a lot of anxiety disorders and things like that, which I do, is that change is really, really terrifying for them usually. It's really hard for a lot of us. So when you know change is coming up, like if you're in a workplace or things like that, and you're dealing with a colleague or something like that, if you ask them how they feel and like what they need, and maybe you do that one-on-one, introduce, particularly if there's a change thing, and you might want to talk to them like before the meeting where you tell everybody. I've had a lot of times when I've had change, it comes up in a meeting, it's like, we're going to get everybody together. It turns out we're going to do this, and I will have a panic attack because I didn't know what was going on, and I immediately get into a freak show situation. And I feel this really strongly, but I feel like I can't say anything because there's a bunch of other people who seem to be dealing with it okay. So that's really tough. And I think it's really important to encourage them and to enable them to seek help. And I think that's a really key thing. There's a thing that I think that having a culture in your workplace or in whatever you do that encourages this kind of thing and allows people and enables people to seek out help is really important. There's a program called Mental Health First Aid that I think is really cool. It's all over the country, so if you look up, there's probably stuff like around here, people who do these courses. If you work at a company, I think that it would be cool to ask your company, like maybe have a couple people get there and say, yes, this is important, and go ask them and say, hey, could you maybe pay for some of us to go take this? Or is there anybody here who like runs their own company or things like that? All right, well, if you run a company and you have employees, commit to doing this and like learning how to address these kinds of issues so that you can, if you have the power to create a safe environment where people feel okay dealing with this stuff, I think you have an obligation to do so. So, okay, I'm almost done. But the thing is, I really need your help with this stuff. I get up and I talk about this stuff, and I think it's important. But I also think that it's important that we spread the word about this and try to combat the stigmas that go along with this. So I need your help with this stuff in terms of like talking and sharing and learning about these things. The first link it's on my website. OSMI, that's the open sourcing mental illness thing. And there there's a bunch of resources there. There are all the videos of the times I've given this talk and all the slides and stuff like that. So I really, really encourage you to talk about this stuff. Email people that you know and say, hey, this is important. And it doesn't have to be about me. You can go someplace else, find other resources, send them to Mental Health First Aid or send them to like Mental Health America or other organizations that deal with this kind of stuff. But the important thing is that you do it and you do it now. Like, don't wait. Don't wait and say, like, oh, that's a good idea, but I'm not going to think about it. I get around to it later. Take the time to email or tweet or post or something about that. And anything that I've shown here, any of these URLs or messages or words, don't mention me if you don't want to. That's fine. But just something to get this conversation going so that we can try to address this so that it does not have to be so scary and it does not have to be so cold and dark and painful for people who have to deal with this stuff. So if you could do that, I'd super duper appreciate it. That'd be neat. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. There's a URL there again if you want to look at that and look at more stuff like this. So thank you. Thanks very much. I guess I could answer questions if anybody has questions. Does anybody have a question? Or you can talk to me later. Okay, question. You do have a question? You'll talk to me later. Okay. All right. Yeah, did you have, yeah, what are you going to say? How many kids do I have? Just one. Yep. Yes. That is an interesting, as a parent, has been a challenge for me because for a long time, before I had a kid, I felt very melancholy about childhood in general. Like, I'm the kind of person that I felt like I would see a children's book and feel sad and depressed. And it was really because I felt like my childhood was pretty good, and then in junior high, everything went to shit. And so what I felt was that it was kind of like I learned that no, the world really isn't nice. And that's that's an unpleasant thing to think about. So it's like ultimately the nice things about childhood turn out to be not true. For one reason, I could talk to you for hours about that. But that has been, in many ways, it's been really helpful because having a kid, I think, restored my faith in that it's okay and it's not necessarily that way for everybody. And it was really important for me not to imprint my fears about what I have gone through and things I've dealt with, that they would necessarily be that way for him. And so that has been interesting and is something I could certainly talk about for a long time. But it's a challenge. And I think one of the things the other thing that you become acutely aware of is that and this is something I've been dealing with my therapist a lot and talking about, is that what are the consequences for how I react to things? And that there are consequences for it that are beyond just how it affects me in a negative way. There are consequences to how it affects my son, how it affects his mother, how it affects all of those people who are around me, because it makes things harder. So you end up not just doing it for your sake, but you end up doing things for other people's sake too. And sometimes that has proved to be a better motivator than just doing it for myself. So, yeah. Yeah, please, go ahead. Mhm. Yep. Yes.
They're afraid as well.
Yeah. Right.
And I mean, I think empathy, but I mean, if you could talk a little bit more, like, who is your top five maybe?
Oh God, top five. That would be the top. Number one is I'm not a lawyer, and two, I pay little attention to these issues, even though I know they're very important. It's just it's not what I deal with because I'm not in HR, for example. Um, but those are really good points. The best thing I'd recommend is actually talk to people who sort of know about it. And what I would recommend is, in my case, I went to starting to ask these kind of questions, and I went to the local chapter of Mental Health America, and I asked them and said, "Hey, what are the kinds of things that employers need to think about how do you make that kind of a culture?" But there's also issues. There's legal issues you have to deal with. There's privacy issues. There's shit, a bunch of stuff comes up. Somebody has, if they're not capable of doing their job, things come up. For some reason, a person leaves or they're let go or something like that, and then, oh, well, you asked this, and now maybe they're scared of having a lawsuit or something like that. Potential scenario could be something like that. I would say two things. I'd say that mental health first aid is a really good idea. It helps you figure out how to identify those kinds of issues and deal with them. The second thing I'd say is that you talk to people who deal with this, like an organization like Mental Health America. I looked up and I didn't see a chapter in Seattle, which surprised me. But there are other organizations like that, and if you go to my page, the funktron.com/OSMI, there's a bunch of links there for resources. So what I would probably recommend is you go to one of them and say, "Hey, I need to learn more about this because I want to have a safe and I want to have a culture in our organization that is supportive of folks, but I want to know how to do that in the context of all the legal issues you have to deal with too, and because obviously that's super important. So that is what I would recommend. Is that twofold thing? I think that unfortunately, I'm not about legal issues. I don't know enough about it, and that's one of the things I'm trying to look up. But that would be where I would start. And in fact, actually, the local chapter of MHA is going to start. They're going to do a lecture series that has people coming in from like HR group, like who work in HR departments, and talk about these kinds of things. There's no reason you couldn't do that here. That's a town of 100,000. Here, you could totally do that. There's got to be interest in it. So there's no reason not to talk about it. There's plenty of resources. It's just a matter of like sitting down, figuring out how to get it together, and then making that happen. So, yeah. That's a good question. One of the things that comes up a lot is how they've been helpful and not helpful. I think the biggest things have to deal, and I've been pretty lucky in this regard, but there's a couple things. One, I've occasionally run into issues where there were HR policies that didn't make any sense, and there was probably a reason they were put in place. But the fact is that if applying them across the board was problematic. Like I ran into a thing where, I would have bad days, and sometimes I would take a sick day because I was sick, right? I wasn't in a position to work, and it didn't happen a lot. I was still capable of doing my job. I never used too many sick days or things like that, but I might take half a day, might take a day here and there. At an organization I worked at, 10, 12 years ago, they had a policy that you had a certain number of sick days, but you could not take them. Let's say you had 10 sick days. You could not take 10 individual separate sick days. You could only do them in 3 groups. So apparently what they would rather have me do is be out of the office for 3 days. That was an example of that kind of thing. And it's not officially, but I got sort of had to get a sit down and talk to in HR. And that was the opposite of empathy. That was, you're breaking this rule. And I'm trying to get back to work to be productive for you. And, so that, and it's just, it's stuff like that. It's like, and there is a balance, and as an organization, you have to be aware of that, and you have a lot of people to think about. And you have to make sure that everybody's protected, right? But at the same time, it was clear in that situation, for example, that at least what I heard was what was written down on this paper was more important than how you feel. And when you make people feel that way, they feel they don't trust the organization anymore. So that is like, so that was a good example of like, I felt like what not to do, even though I felt like there were good people and good stuff, but what it was the policy was more important than the person. And when you do that, people don't trust the organization anymore. So they're not going to feel safe. They're not going to feel safe to talk about that stuff. They're not going to feel safe to go to their boss and talk about something that could be perceived as a weakness or something that doesn't allow them to do their job correctly. And the other thing that I hear is that I have heard a lot of people talk about, like, should I even bring up that that I deal with some mental health issue in an interview? I hear that all the time because people are scared to bring it up. Now, would they be scared to say, I am a diabetic and sometimes I have to go take an insulin shot? No, they wouldn't. And everybody's okay with that. But this, that for all the things that say they're not supposed to discriminate against them, there's no way to track that. So they would say, oh, yeah, maybe I'm going to put this guy at the bottom of the pile because I don't want to deal with that. So it's that kind of stuff. Is people, and I don't have a good solution for that because I know that that in some cases you're going to run into organizations that don't want to deal with that, and they're not going to be cool about it. Now, I'm at a point where I'm lucky enough where I'll just up front say, if I'm thinking about another position or I'm talking to somebody, I'll just say, hey, this is something I deal with, so if you want to work with me, that's what, because I don't want to be in a place that's going to have a problem with that. But I also know that I'm lucky enough to be a little picky about that, and most people aren't. So that's the thing too. It's like it even starts at the interview process. Do you trust this company or not? And that's a huge question. And again, culturally, you wouldn't have that same kind of issue with a ton of other ailments, but we do have that issue with mental health. And so I don't know if I have a great solution for it, but that's what I'm going to keep trying to talk with folks about that and figure out what are the things that you could say or not say and stuff like that. So, does anybody else have anything? I talked for a long time. I'm sorry. All right. Well, I'll be around for a little bit. If you want to talk to me, that's awesome. Thanks. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Feel free to stick around for a while to talk to Ed or each other, eat some more snacks, and we need to be out of here no later than 9:30, so we got some time to hang out and talk if you want to. Thanks.